you talk in the book about neoliberal civil rights.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Yeah. So this gets at kind of the heart of the black politics element, right? So there's a way that we've written. So a lot of us, when we talk about black politics, what we're really talking about is racial politics. That is, we're talking about the ways in which kind of black people in general have resources withheld from them because of racism and white supremacy, right? When I'm talking about black politics, I'm talking about the way that resources are distributed within black communities, right? And what you look at, when you look at black communities, you've got some black people with a lot of resources, some black people with maybe with fewer resources than that, and then a whole bunch of black people with nothing. So I'm interested in how that happens. So when you talk about neoliberal civil rights, what you're talking about is the way in which what we've done within what black elites have done within black communities is taking their own class interests and then swapping them out for the interests of black people as a whole, as if they were the same thing, right? Mm-hmm. So you have elite after elite making basically neoliberal arguments about what black people should do, and then the results of those arguments or the results of those policies is that black elites end up getting the bulk of the resources, a bulk of the care within black communities, and that leaves a lot of black people out. Mm-hmm, that happens whether you're talking about black pastors who promote the prosperity gospel, whether you're talking about black mayors like Michael Nutter in Philadelphia, Adrian Finney, who's not in office anymore, in D.C., Cory Booker, who used to be mayor of Newark, Mayor Stephanie Rawlings Blake, who's stepping down in Baltimore, a range of political officials, and then a range of other actors who are promoting basically neoliberal policies and arguing that those policies can work within work best for the black interest.
And I will add Deval Patrick as governor of Massachusetts.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I have to do that. And, the thing is that all of these people, this is where we have to get this squared away about the politics in our community, is that we're not saying these people are not nice people. Last Saturday when I was excoriating Antonin Scalia, I wasn't talking about him as a father of 9 children and having a wife.
That's right. That's right.
And his son is a priest. I was talking to him as a political figure because he changed the Supreme Court into a political entity. And that is where we have to make our distinctions. You're listening to Our Common Ground. And Dr. Lester Spence is with us tonight. I mean, we have got, I think that is, I want people to know that we're not trying to beat up on black people because they got elected. We're not trying to beat up on black people because they are successful or they have something beyond middle class. That's not it. But we have a economic and educational and social distribution within our own community, and it is a prism. And we cannot afford to continue to think that all blacks share the same interests. They do not. I have nothing in common with Miss Fishnet Beyonce Carter. Nothing.
Yeah.
She's got more money than me. She's got better legs than me. She's got everything. She's younger than me. So we've got to start thinking about some of these people. And yes, Dr. Spence, I have excoriated John Lewis, the representative, U.S. representative from Baltimore, whose name I can't think about right now. I think that there are people who have lost a sense of all but a small pool of people in our community, a small pool of the problems within our community. And because they have done that, everything gets kind of overwhelming to them.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And that interest thing is really important, right? Because one really simple argument is that these people kind of hate black people or sold out or they don't love black people. It's like, no, they have different interests, right? They have different interests because of where they kind of are in the social hierarchy, or in part because of that, right? And so you when you're basically knocking Antonin Scalia, he may be the nicest guy in the world, right? He may be a wonderful father or grandfather, but his policies are horrible. Similarly, the political officials I'm talking about, so like take Kwame Kilpatrick, the former mayor of Detroit. Kwame Kilpatrick loved black people. He had very different interests than most of the black people he governed in Detroit, right? The same thing for Michael Nutter in Philadelphia. The same thing I'd argue for Mayor Stephanie Rawlings Blake here. When we talk about love and care and value, it's not that those things aren't important. They are, but we have to get back to interests, right? What are their interests? There are people who love black people who have interests that are very different than the interests of poor working class black men and women.
And this turn is that we have to see that we have a politics that is promoting the control of individuals rather than the control of government rather than controlling the market. We saw that in how the banks were treated during the mortgage crisis. We see that in the privatization in many ways in our government services. We see that in the push to privatize Social Security, to privatize food and housing and other kinds of programs. So once we can see that, then I think we can embrace the areas in which we have to act. We have to bring solutions. And in the chapters that you talk about solutions, you give us a picture of what they might be. But my question to you is, what is going to reverse this trend? Who do we have to call? Who do we have to club against the head? And who do we have to challenge?
So what we have to do is basically generate kind of a culture of democratic critique within American community in general, but within black communities specific. We have to. So what I mean by democratic critique is where we kind of take more and more responsibility, not in a conservative way, but kind of take responsibility for really going at the people who represent us, who represent us, that is people we elect in office, by people who claim to represent us, people speaking truth to power. We have to, whether you're talking about civil rights leaders or our church leaders or our elected, we have to kind of develop or redevelop a kind of a critique. Generate a critique that's designed to kind of increase our capacity to govern ourselves, right? So that's the one thing. But the other thing we need to do is we need to aggressively organize collectively on behalf of the public interest. So I focus on 4 examples in the solutions chapter: the Chicago Teachers Union, the Malcolm X grassroots movement, who elected black radical nationalist to mayor of Jackson, Mississippi, Chokwe Lumumba. I talk about a successful attempt to repeal a $104 million jail for youth charged as adults in Maryland. And then I talk about the Black Lives Matter movement just in general, right? But you see in all those cases are people organizing. It's people organizing, people kind of using moral arguments but not relying on moral arguments, people kind of developing alternatives based on their interests, and developing alternative forms of expertise. And we see people kind of create organizations that are kind of membership-based, in which you have clear transparency and clear mechanisms of accountability, right? Now, all this stuff I'm talking about may not actually lead to the world that we want, but we know that the world we want won't come without it, and we know that this type of labor is going to bring us closer.
Now, recently we just did a program which I call the title was How to Fix Our Politics, and my premise was we've got to bakerize it. We've got to learn how to organize, educate, agitate, and examine. And I think that pretty much fits in to this whole idea of looking at the models. Why do you think, for instance, Black Lives Matter is valuable in developing a solution?
So what Black Lives Matter does, or what the different organizations that we think of when we think of Black Lives Matter, what they do is they do a few different things. One is they really, really bring to light the role that policing plays in a neoliberal turn. In cities like Chicago, in cities like Detroit, in cities like Baltimore, police spending has taken up more and more, a larger and larger chunk of the city's municipal resources, and that police spending is mostly used in order to police working class populations in general, Black populations specifically. Right? Black Lives Matter does that more than any other group. In fact, they do that in a similar way that Occupy Wall Street, brings our attention to wealth inequality.
Let me step aside for a minute before you go to the second thing. I have been critical of Black Lives Matter in their structure and organizing. Our people in our community will have a difficult time in grasping the straws of engagement with Black Lives Matter because they say nobody's in charge. Somebody's got to be in charge. This is an adult world. And go ahead.
Well, so let me finish though, right? Because it's not that. So I got critiques for all those examples I showed, those examples, and I have critiques of Black Lives Matter, right? But I first want to talk about what they do, right? Because we want to kind of give love to Black folk when they're doing, about what they're doing that's right before we kind of say, okay, this is what you're doing that's not right, at least in the case of Black Lives Matter. So the second thing they're doing is they're emphasizing kind of a queer type of Black nationalism, where instead of the conservative Black nationalism that says that basically we're going to predominantly support kind of Black male initiatives that support conservative values, you're talking about Black Lives Matter folk who are supporting Black folk who are not quote unquote respectable, queer Black folk who are transgendered. We've never seen that ever, right? That's a new thing that they're introducing. That's really beautiful to see. That's the second thing they do. And then the third thing they do is they understand that what you're talking about when we're dealing with the police is at some level you have to deal with the state and state policy, public policy, right? That's the third thing they do. But what they don't do, what some of them do, but not all of them do, and this is where Ella Baker comes into play, and this is where your critique comes into play, is they aren't necessarily all about organizing. Right. In a number of instances, what you have is groups who are interested in doing activist work, but they're not really interested in developing the type of institutions that are deeply connected to Black Black neighborhoods. They're not necessarily interested in doing the type of institutional work that Ella Baker did to make sure that regular Black folk have the ability to say what goes on in these organizations, and they don't necessarily they haven't thought through how to develop the institutional mechanisms to enable them to last for longer than a year, right? So you think about going back to Occupy Wall Street, most of those occupations were killed by the state within a year, right? Now, granted, they don't necessarily die, but they're all dissolved. In the Black Lives Matter case, in cases like the Black Youth Project 100 in Chicago, you actually see people thinking about what a long-term organization should look like, but they're not doing that enough in other places.
Yes. Okay. As different and very, very different from Jackson Rising, Kali Okuno has been a guest. Brother Chakwe, prior to his passing, has been a guest here at Our Common Ground, and those two organizing and education differences, I think, are significant.
Yes. Yes, I agree. I agree. Oh, and the other aspect, and this is where they do share something with Jackson, is they all start locally, right? So what happens in, they start organizing locally in Ferguson after Michael Brown was killed, et cetera. But that Malcolm X grassroots project, the thing is the Black Lives Matter project as it stands right now is really a youth thing, right? Where if you look at that Malcolm X grassroots movement in Jackson and other places, you're talking about something that's really deeply neighborhood-based and that's multi-generational, right? In some ways, I understand how we focused on youth, but in other ways, I kind of agree with the critique of somebody like Adolph Reed when he says, like, youth is just one aspect of our identity. Youth age out, and all of a sudden they aren't youth anymore. What we need to be doing is, yes, we need to be involving youth, but we need to be thinking about how to organize just Black, poor, and working class populations in general without an eye necessarily to how old you are, right? That's a significant difference in Jackson, and you can understand. It's common sense to say, wow, if you got an organization that has 60-year-old people who never left Jackson, 40-year-old people that maybe some of them are new to Jackson, and then 20-year-old people who may leave or may come back, that organization is going to be more stable over the long term than an organization that has nothing but 18-years-olds. Right? That's just common sense.